This is where I think it gets really interesting, because I want you to think about this for a second. I think sometimes the best argument for God is the fact that we could make an argument. Here's what I mean. We happen to be conscious creatures. I had a case one time where a 5-year-old boy was murdered by his father, shot in the forehead. He then killed himself, the father. And it was tragic. When we got there, everyone struggled with it, especially those people who do not believe in God or do not believe we are creatures, anything other than our physical bodies. I work with guys who think the only life you really have is the physical life you experience in this universe. You're just bodies, brains. You have no soul. You don't live beyond the grave. And if that's the case, these kinds of stories are shocking. And I had people at the crime scene who either wanted to laugh it off, or the CSI officer couldn't stay. She had to leave. She couldn't watch somebody. She couldn't work a scene with someone the age of the 6-year-old. You know, my grandfather, this is him at 6. I didn't know him at that age. Of course, he got older. I knew him as he was an old man. It was hard enough to watch the 90-year-old Warner die. If he had been killed at 5 or 6, that would have been tragic if all we have are material bodies in this material universe. But is that true? Is that all we are, is material bodies, material beings? Well, I think the problem is if atheism is true, we all have brains, but if atheism is true, do we really have minds? We seem to experience minds, but it's a problem for atheism. Here's why. By the way, it's called the problem of mind. And it's called the problem of mind, or it's called sometimes the mind-body problem. And the reason why it's called that is because how do you get a mind if all you have is a material universe? Because the mind is not material. In other words, in a universe that's just made up of space, time, and matter, you can get a brain. That's another material thing in the material universe. But can you get a mind from a material universe? That's the trick. How do you get this? Well, maybe they're the same thing. Maybe brains are just minds. Really? If that's the case, we could solve the problem and stay inside the room. But is that the case? If I'm looking at the killer, this is the guy who I say later on is the killer of his son, Ryan. How do I know that this guy is really the killer? Well, if all the attributes of this guy match all the attributes, if the DNA this guy has matches the DNA at the room, I know I have the same person. Anytime you have two things that have the same attributes, you have an identity relationship. They are the same. Well, could I do that here? Are all the attributes of the brain identical to all the attributes of the mind? If they are, we can get an answer by staying inside the room, because mind is just brain. Well, that's the question. I don't think they're the same at all. There's a difference between brain and mind. Let me show you 5 ways they differ. Number 1, brains are physical, and therefore you can measure them. I can take this and I can weigh it. I can measure its depth, its length, its mass, but I can't really do that with the mind. This is a significant difference between brain and mind. Brain is measurable, mind is immeasurable. Got it? One difference. But it gets worse. Here's Ben Carson, okay? Not that I'd forget about politics for a second. He is a neurosurgeon. He should know something about this issue. If I ask Ben to remember and tell me about his memories of his mother, he can report those to me and tell me about all the interconnected memories he has and how that made him feel and the impact it has on his mental life today. He could do that because he privately knows how he feels. I could not take Ben's head off and look at his brain and discover that information. I couldn't. And no, we're never gonna get to that place, because even when we think we see brain activity and then we think we know what it means, it's only because the guy tells you what it means. He's got to report it. Why? Because brains can be publicly accessed, but your mental entities cannot be publicly accessed. This is yet another difference between brain and mind. Got it? I just love showing brains too, by the way. This is so cool. If I rented this house for a holiday and I'm sitting in this bedroom and I hear a noise outside of a burglar, now my mind, my mental thoughts are obsessed with the burglar. Is he gonna get in my house? Is my house front door locked? Where's my gun? I'm thinking about all these things, right? Well, there's a difference between my thoughts about the burglar and the burglar himself, between the physical entity and the mental entity. Think about this. My thoughts are actually dependent upon the burglar. Why? Because my thoughts are about him. Mental entities are always about something else. But the something else is not about the something else. The something else just is. This is the difference between mental entities and physical entities. It's what I call an isness or an aboutness. Mental entities are about, physical entities are. This is called by philosophers intentionality. This is another difference between mind and brain. It's isness versus aboutness. And I could be wrong about that burglar. He might not even exist. As a matter of fact, I could hear noises. It may not be a burglar. His existence is up for dispute. But my thoughts about him are not up for dispute. I could be wrong about him, but the thinking he's there, you can't dispute that with me. You can dispute whether he exists, but you can't dispute my thoughts. Another difference between mental entities and physical entities. One is incorrect, perhaps, but the other is indisputable. Last thing, you could train me as a SWAT officer on how to get involved in a shooting. And you could tell me how my gun's gonna operate, and you can tell me about the physical processes of the person I'm gonna shoot at, and you could even tell me how we're gonna physically enter the room. You might even be able to explain to me how I might physically react afterwards. But that would not be everything I would know about a shooting, because it turns out this would only be the objective, material, and personal facts about shootings. Once I'm involved in a shooting, I'm now gonna learn a bunch of stuff you could not explain to me from physical objective properties. I'm gonna have subjective reactions to those physical properties. This is yet another difference between mental entities and physical entities. Mental entities are very personal, physical entities are not. So I've now looked at this identity relationship, right? If this equals this, same guy. If this equals this, same guy. Here's the problem. 5 ways they don't equal each other. So we cannot say that brains are minds. They are very different things. But how do I get this in the physical universe? That's easy. You can get brains. What you can't get is minds. The fact you can think about this at all demonstrates you have something that the atheism can't even give you. You've actually got a mind. But under an atheistic worldview, that's not even possible. This is exactly what, for example, David Chalmers says, who's an atheist. Conscious experience is at once the most familiar thing in the world and the most mysterious. There's nothing we know about more directly than consciousness, but it's far from clear how to reconcile it with everything else we do know. Why does it exist? What does it do? How could it possibly arise from lumpy gray matter? That's the problem of mind. So how do they explain it? Well, one way they explain it is just to say that, hey, mental states are brain states, but I've already showed you 5 ways they're not. Or they'll say, really bite the bullet, and they'll say, well, I gotta redefine what I mean by mental states. Maybe it's just an expression of behavior. You don't even know what someone's thinking until you see them. Really? Redefining. Redefining doesn't get it done. Or maybe just say, hey, it's an illusion. You think you have consciousness, but you're wrong. It's an illusion. Really? So where does this illusion reside? In your conscious mind? That's the problem. Consciousness is hard to evade. So if I want to stay inside the room with one of these 3 explanations, good luck. These don't work. They're either unsupported by the evidence, they have to do a ridiculous redefinition, or they ignore what we all experience commonly. That's the problem. Now, if in fact you do have minds because you're the product of a mind outside the room, that would start to explain things. This is what an atheist who's not very popular right now, Thomas Nagel, says about this. So long as the mental is irreducible to the physical, the appearance of conscious physical organisms is left unexplained by a naturalistic account of the familiar type. On a purely materialistic understanding of biology, consciousness would have to be regarded as a tremendous and inexplicable extra brute fact about the world. Unless, of course, there is a mind that consciously creates in its image. Then you can understand why you have a mind.